Starting in May 2020, demonstrations over the police killing of George Floyd have been held in the city of Portland, Oregon, concurrent with protests in other cities in the United States and around the world. By July 2020, many of the protests, which had been held virtually every day since May 28, drew more than 1,000 participants. Protests continued into August, September, and October 2020, often drawing hundreds. The majority of the protests in Portland have been peaceful, but many demonstrations have involved rioting, heated confrontations with law enforcement and counter-protesters, and use of tear gas and other weapons. There have been numerous instances of arson, looting, vandalism, and injuries during nighttime protests. One person was shot and killed in the aftermath of a clash between protesters and counter-protesters. In early July, the federal government deployed law enforcement officers to Portland for the stated purpose of protecting federal property amid the unrest. The deployment was criticized for not clearly identifying officers and for seizing protesters not on or near federal property, including by Portland's mayor and most of the state's congressional delegation. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection Service defended the practice on the grounds of protecting the officers' personal safety. Several lawsuits were filed by and on behalf of journalists and legal observers against local and federal law enforcement, and by the state against several federal agencies. Protests have continued in Portland in the aftermath of the 2020 United States presidential election. Portland has also continued to have riots after the January 20, 2021 inauguration of Joe Biden, mostly by anti-government anarchists. Protests have also occurred near the ICE facility, and clashes have occurred with police. The protests were initially precipitated by the killing of George Floyd, a black man, by police in Minneapolis. The New York Times reported that demonstrators in Portland, including some who identify as Antifa, the loose coalition of self-described anti-fascist activists, have had years of conflict with law enforcement. Other recent police killings of people of color, including Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and Jacob Blake, have contributed to the national and local unrest driving the protests. Protesters have also drawn attention to a number of black people killed by local police. The Oregonian identified the 2003 shooting of Kendra James as an inflection point that galvanized the black community and inspired a movement to fundamentally reimagine law enforcement. The Oregonian reported that the 39 people killed by Portland police between 2003 and 2020 were disproportionately black. Among those killed since 2003 are Aaron Campbell, Quanis Hayes, and Patrick Kimmons. Expand section, date equals July 20. A number of different organizations have led demonstrations, including Rose City Justice and the Albina Ministerial Alliance. The Facebook and Twitter accounts associated with the Pacific Northwest Youth Liberation Front have served as information hubs for sharing protest plans. The group does not have identifiable leaders and describes itself as a decentralized network of autonomous youth collectives dedicated to direct action towards total liberation. The group's Facebook and Twitter accounts were created in February 2017 and have 6,100 and 28,700 followers, respectively, as of late July 2020. The group has used a black flag emoji, which often symbolizes anarchism. Children have taken leadership roles in some demonstrations. In Portland and across the country, hundreds of demonstrators gathered on May 28, at one point blocking the entrance to the Multnomah County Justice Center. There were two peaceful demonstrations held on May 29. A eulogy for Black America was organized by the Portland chapter of NAACP at Terry Shrunk Plaza in downtown Portland, and a vigil was organized by the PNW Youth Liberation Front at Peninsular Park in the Piedmont neighborhood of North Portland. Crowd estimates for the demonstration at Terry Shrunk Plaza ranged from 100 or so to hundreds of people. The event included several speakers including Portland City Commissioner Jo Ann Hardesty. She was reportedly visibly overcome by emotion, and said, "This is the reality of being black in America. Over and over and over again. Black people have been killed. And there has been silence from the majority community. Black people are tired. Black people are exhausted by racism. The president of the Portland NAACP chapter, Reverend A. D. Mondane, also spoke. More than 1,000 people gathered at Peninsula Park, where ministers and Black Panthers spoke against police brutality. From the crowd, hundreds marched to downtown Portland via Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and the Burnside Bridge. Along the way, some people started breaking windows, tagging buildings with graffiti, looting, and setting vehicles and buildings on fire. A riot